Okay, for the first time ever, definitely didn't already talk about this. The word of the day is act. Acts are a way of breaking really long scripts. Remember we talked about how 1 minute of a script in Hollywood really is 1 minute of screen time. So sometimes you'll get scripts that are huge, right? For Oppenheimer, it would have been a 180-page script because 1 page is 1 minute. So when you've got that much to deal with, breaking the script down into more manageable parts can be helpful. So acts are the first way of breaking it down. Everybody look at the picture. See right here when my mouse is wiggling? Sort of. It says Act 1, Scene 1. This is from Romeo and Juliet. And that's the first step of breaking a script into smaller bits. So if you look at examples, it's pretty normal in a long movie or play or musical. It's normal to have acts, and usually 3 acts is kind of normal. Obviously, there will be people who do different things, but it's pretty typical to go Act 1 is the beginning. Act 2 is the middle. Act 3 is the end. So I have this pulled up, but do you see the sentence where it says acts are like parts in a book? You might not have read a novel that has parts, but see this picture right here? This novel had kind of an index at the beginning that talked about how part 1 were these chapters and part 2 were these chapters. But they broke the novel into smaller, more manageable bits. So it's the same with acts, that we might break them down. And let's go ahead. Everybody give me your own example in the You Try box to show me that you understand. Remember, it could be a picture. It could be using it in a sentence. But before we move on to scene, so don't turn it in yet. Don't turn it in yet, but give me your own example in the You Try box. You really can't talk about act without also talking about scene. So that's going to be part 2. So don't turn this in yet. Everybody go to the next slide. Okay, so scenes are a way of taking an act and breaking them down even farther. I like comparing scenes to a chapter in a book. That's obviously a lot more common. When you're writing a book, which that will be one of our big projects, there's kind of not a right or wrong formula for when to start a new chapter. Some authors will make their chapter purposely be kind of a cliffhanger so that you want to keep reading to the next chapter. For scenes, though, it's very, very specific in a script. That you'll see that I put it in red because it's so important. So look on yours or look on mine. But every time you have a set change in a script, that's when you start a new scene. Because if your script that you're writing right now actually did get turned into something real, there's all those behind-the-scenes people who would be making your story come to life. So when they have to build a new set, right? Like if our script was happening at Albion, Mrs. Coach's classroom versus Mrs. Holyoke's classroom, those are 2 different sets. They look a little bit different, right? So if there was a set change, I would have to start a new scene, and that's when then you would also, just like the picture, that's when you would have a new slug line and a new action every single time. So if you have Act 1, Scene 1, slug line action. Then I have Act 1, Scene 2, slug line action. That's how it's going to be every single time. So I obviously have this little breakdown here, but this is a pretty normal breakdown for like a movie like Captain America. I could break it into 3 parts, beginning, middle, end, and then I could break those bits into smaller bits, which are then scenes. So there's not exactly a right or wrong amount of scenes, but remember, rising action, if you're thinking plot line, remember exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Usually rising action is pretty typically the longest part of the plot. So that's why you see how here on Act 2 usually will have more scenes, but again, there's not an exact right or wrong, because sometimes people break the mold and do their own thing. I have a quick video to show you. Does anyone have questions about act or scene before I show you my video for today? Yeah.
So let's say I start act. How would in writers do it? How would I specifically put down this act 1?
Let's do it together. Okay, so everybody open up another tab and go to your script. Okay, so keep your vocab chart open, but come to your script. So this was my practice one, right? And go to the very top, put your cursor right before your first slug line and press enter. And then when you come to that now blank line, see where my mouse is wiggling right here? They actually have a button for you that it will do it for you. Click this part that says new act right here. It looks like a quotation mark. And then you could just type in Act 1. Yeah, from now that I'm teaching you this specifically, now I want you to actually add this into your script. Yep. So then, since this is the first scene, do a comma and then do scene 1. Okay? And now you would just do that every time there's a set change. If there's a set change, then you're going to do that before your slug line and before your action. Yep. Act 1, scene 1. Yep. Good question. So I do think that it kind of depends on the context and your script. In that case, I would. Especially if they're spending a long time in that other location, then I would make a new scene, a new slug line, a new action. But save yourself some time. If it's a really quick change, like if it's in somebody's house and they're just going from like the kitchen to the living room, you could use like a parenthetical in that case. And if it's just going to be a little bit of time that they're there, just describe it in a parenthetical. And you don't have to go through the hassle of a whole new slug line and action. So that's what I would do in that case. Other question? Yeah. So new day, it's up to you. That if it's in the same set, then you don't have to start a new scene. You could describe using a parenthetical that it's the same day, but it's later in that day. But if it's really important to you that it's very clear that it's a different time of day, then you could start a new scene in that case. Those are good questions. Okay, so before you are on any other tab, let's come back to your vocab chart for just a minute. If you kind of were stuck getting an idea for the you try box for act or scene, this guy is going to talk about script writing for a couple of minutes here. So for the you try box, feel free to steal your idea. We're just going to watch the first 5 minutes.
Today is all about 3-act story structure. Disclaimer, I am not a story guru. I am learning just like everybody else, but I have written a few scripts. I'm really familiar with it, and I just want to share my knowledge with you guys. All right, guys, this one's going to be a little long, so get ready. What is 3-act structure?
Okay, so just because I do think he has valuable stuff to say, let's go ahead, everybody who's not creative writing too, go ahead, screen space and forward for me. Just so I get your undivided attention. So screen space and forward, Charlotte, Pippa. Okay.
Well, it's the basics of storytelling. As you know, every movie has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In a nutshell, it's a guide used to write and evaluate stories, and it's nothing new. It's actually pretty old. It's Aristotle. Why is 3-act structure so important? Well, I could give you 3 reasons. Number 1, it's a roadmap. Anybody who's written a screenplay before knows how tough it is to write a movie. There's a lot of this going on. It's like putting a puzzle together. It's extremely creatively challenging, and it's easy to get lost. 3-act story structure is meant to guide you and keep you from getting lost. It's a tool to help you build your story. And number 2, it helps keep your story moving forward and progressing. Nothing bores an audience quicker than repetition. Story structure is the backbone that keeps your story changing and evolving so it stays engaging and doesn't become redundant. And number 3, have you ever watched a movie and thought this to yourself?
Nothing's happening. This sucks.
70% of movies that drag and don't seem to go anywhere usually have bad story structure. Something to think about. There are many interpretations of the 3-act structure floating around out there. It seems like every other screenwriting book or guru has their own version of a specific function in the story. 1 page of a screenplay is roughly 1 minute in movie time. Act 1 is the setup. It's the first 25 to 30 minutes of your film.
And remember, exposition and rising action can take a long time. And we're only working on this project until next Thursday. So if you kind of don't want to be stuck in the mire that's exposition and rising action, you really are allowed to skip ahead to like climax and falling action where it usually is more interesting. You do not have to start in Act 1.
If you're writing your script, it's important to have a strong opening. Without a strong, attention-grabbing opening, no one's going to want to read your script or watch your film. Sometimes this is called a flashbang open, sometimes it's called a hook. In the first 10 to 15 minutes, you set up tone, you introduce the main character or characters, and you set up the status quo or the ordinary world that they live in. You're essentially giving the audience all the information needed to tell the rest of the story. About halfway through the first act, we get our inciting incident. Some people call this the catalyst, and the hero's journey is called the call to adventure.
And remember, if you're writing and you have writer's block, it's probably because you don't have a bit. Yeah, that is a good face. Sorry. If you're writing and you're stuck, it's probably that you don't have a big enough problem, right? Stories need problems to move them forward. So just something to think about. Okay.
Usually happens at like the 10 or 15 minute mark. This is the event that takes the status quo and does this to it. All of a sudden, we got a problem to solve. In The Matrix, this is when Neo gets the anonymous message on the computer screen that sends him on a quest to find out what the Matrix is.
Like, he finds out he's living in a computer program. So
What the hell?
In How to Train Your Dragon, this is the moment when Hiccup finds the dragon that he shot down in the forest, but he realizes that he can't kill it. The rest of Act 1, your main character either refuses the call to adventure, avoids doing something about the problem, or prepares to take action. We get our first plot point at the end of Act 1. This usually happens around minute 25 to 30. This is the first turning point in our story that sends the plot in a new direction and propels us into Act 2. Some people call it the Act 1 climax, some people call it the first act break, some people call it the lock-in. In Star Wars Episode 4, this is when Luke comes home and discovers that his family has been killed by stormtroopers, resulting in his desire to follow Obi-Wan.
sorry, I should have said spoiler alert. But if you don't know that now, you're pretty behind the time at this point.
Kenobi and learn to become a Jedi. Either at this moment or as a result of this moment, our main character decides he's going to take on the problem. The scene usually goes a little something like this. I'm going to take on this problem. The first plot point generally works better if it's something big, distinct, and or memorable. In action movies, this is usually a set piece or a big action sequence. Act 2 is the confrontation. This is where we have all...
Spelled confrontation wrong. Now, what I want to interject really quick, we're going to watch like one more minute, but a lot of stories really do kind of fit a mold. And it's okay if, as a writer, that you are using those molds to your advantage. I honestly cannot remember if I've said this before, so I'm sorry if I have. But, like, it's pretty true. Most, like, chick flicks, for example, kind of like little romance movies, they basically follow the same mold. You can almost tell it down to the minute. Like, you're gonna have two characters who hate each other at the beginning, and then they encounter some sort of problem, and because of that problem, they're like, oh my gosh, I actually like you. And then there's, like, a falling in love montage. And then they break up temporarily for some reason, and then by the end they're like, okay, I like you again. Like, almost every chick flick follows that exact same kind of format. And so that's why when he's talking about, like, minute 30 to 35 is usually this moment in an act, that's because a lot of movies really do. My husband hates watching movies with me because I'll be like, hey, this is going to happen. I can guarantee you. Because I, as a creative writing teacher, can kind of guesstimate, like, I know what that creative writer was thinking. Plus, that kind of format just really, that's, our world follows that. And so, as a creative writer, you can also, though, be thinking on the other side of things. What am I going to do that's different to break that mold that everybody knows? Okay.
Of our rising action. It usually starts 24 to 31-ish minutes into the movie and ends 70 to 90 minutes in the movie, depending on how long the movie is. It's the longest act in the entire movie by far, and it's usually broken up into two parts. If you follow Save the Cat, then the first part of Act 2 is the fun and games. Tension and conflict aren't high yet. Usually we establish new characters, maybe a subplot or two. In love stories, this is where the relationship develops. In buddy cop stories, this is where they go head-to-head and argue with each other because they're such opposites. We usually find montages here. Usually in this section, heroes learn new skills and abilities. In How to Train Your Dragon, this is where Hiccup learns how to fly toothless.
And that's where we're going to stop, only because we're only working on this till next Thursday, so not a lot of you are going to get any farther than that. Before I officially set you loose to start working today, let's see.